So this is our working directory, and I have created two folders inside it, backend and frontend. In the frontend folder, I have created two files that are named index.js and index.html. And index.html is our HTML file which we will use to send our data to the backend, to our spreadsheet. And currently I'm using Bootstrap for styling. I haven't done much of a work in making it too much beautiful or anything. We'll just work on the functionality for this project. As you can see, there are several inputs and labels inside the form, and I'm also using jQuery. And this is the preview for our HTML form. It has several inputs such as email address, name, company, and the appointment date, and then submit button. All right, so in our index.js file, let's write some code which will help us validate our input fields in our HTML form. To do so, let's get DOM. In there, first we will fetch all the input in our HTML form using jQuery and then assign them to variable names. And you can see that there are two variable names, date warning text and time warning text, which is the date help and time help text section in our HTML form. We will use these two text section to warn the user if they input wrong time or wrong date. For instance, if the user selects the weekends for the appointment, then date warning text, it will change from its default color to red to warn them that please select weekdays, not weekends. And similarly, the time warning text will change to red color if the client selects the time which are outside of the office hours. Now we will get the new date and convert it to a ISO string, which will have date and time, and then there's a T separating the date and time. We are getting the date section, and then after that we get date input field in our HTML form, and then we are setting the minimum attribute to today, preventing the user to select any date before today, like yesterday. So that's what I'm doing here, like I'm showing you here in the HTML form. We cannot select the date before today. With this, we will again get the date input, and now we will set the warning text like I mentioned earlier. If the user selects any day except for the weekdays like Saturday and Sunday, which is 0 and 6 in case of DoGet day, then we will change the color from default color to red. Else, we're going to have to change the color back to default by passing empty string in CSS color. We will do the same for the time, but in case of time, if the time is lesser than 9, which is maybe 8 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. or whatever, or if the time is beyond 1700s, then we will again change the color of the time warning text to red, else reset the color to the default value, like I'm showing you here in the HTML form. Now we will declare a function that will be called whenever we click the submit button. That will be called handle button click. We haven't yet assigned it to the click event, but we will assign it after we declare this function. In this function, first we will check if all the values of the input fields in our HTML form are empty or not. If even one input field is empty, then we're gonna alert the user and we're gonna prevent the default because we don't want to reload the HTML form. Else, if all the input fields are filled, then we are supposed to submit that data to the backend. But for now, we are just gonna console log every input field has been filled. Your data is ready to be submitted. Okay, now we're going to assign this function to a click event, submit button.click. Okay, let's reload the HTML form, and then we're only going to fill few input fields and click the submit button. And as you can see, we were alerted that we have to fill all these input fields. So it seems like our empty input checker is working. Now we're gonna fill all the input fields. So let's submit it. Yes, as you can see, we were console logged that every input field has valid data and ready to be submitted. Okay, I haven't done advanced form of validation because this course is not about validation. We just want to connect that front end to our spreadsheet, which we are using at the back end. So please feel free to improve this HTML form by yourself. Next, we will work on connecting our HTML form with the backend. Now, before making any changes in our backend, first of all, let's look at our spreadsheet, and then we will open up our app script project. After that, we will connect our app script with the VS Code and then pull and push changes from and to backend. Okay, so this is the spreadsheet I prepared. It has several columns. The columns with the yellow background are the data that will be submitted from the front end, except for the first one, that is timestamp. It will be something we will create while we're submitting. But yeah, anyways, it's added in the data that we actually submit from HTML form to the sheets. And the ones in the red are the configurations or the changes that are made by AppScript, like GPT questions. It will consist a list of questions that would be prepared by ChatGPT, and it has other settings such as form created, form link, form ID, etc. And it has other worksheets like Cal Events Handler and Form Responses Handler. This both worksheet tab is also part of settings that is required by AppScript for this project. These both have a couple of columns within themselves as well, as you can see. And we will now open up the AppScript project. To connect this cloud project with our project in our VS Code, first of all, we're gonna need the AppScript ID for this project. Let's copy it. Let's go back to our VS Code, and now we will clone the data with Clasp space clone space ID inside quotes, and then space double hyphen root dir and space the current directory. By the way, guys, I have made a separate video on how to connect and work with Clasp, and how to work remotely and then connect to our AppScript project. If you want to learn more about it, you can find the link in the description below and check out that video. Okay, now let's see if it works. As you can see, the Clasp has cloned a few files from the cloud directory. Now we will also create a Clasp ignore file and add the frontend folder to the Clasp ignore, because I don't want to push the front-end section to our cloud project because we're not going to need it there. And I'm going to also delete the code.js file because we will create new files inside the backend, which is actually the place where the codes for the AppScript section will be stored. To connect the backend with our frontend, I've created a new file in our backend folder that is api.js. This is where we will design our API to connect our HTML form with the spreadsheet. First of all, we will create a function called DoGet, which is a method provided by AppScript. DoGet is used a lot with web apps. As you can see in the documentation, it has several parameters. You can either use DoGet or DoPost, not both. Regardless of if we are getting the data or posting the data, we only use one method, either that is DoGet or DoPost, not both. So that is a very strange part of AppScript. Event object is the object parameter provided by AppScript, which consists of several keys like query, string, parameters, and parameter and such. Query string, that is part of the URL that is after the question mark in the address. And then there are parameters, which are a JavaScript object, and we can fetch it by using event object. We will be using e.parameter, not parameters, because we don't have values that we'll be sending as an array. So we will be using parameter. If you want, you can check out other fields by yourselves. As we come down below, you can see an example of the URL address, and query string is the strings that are after the question marks, and the parameters are the keys and values that are part of the query string. As you can see, inside parameters, username is the key, jsmith is value, age is the key, and 21 is the value. And in this way, when we're later on extracting the data from the front end, we will also be fetching the parameter such as e.parameter.username, e.parameter.address, and such. And you can read this documentation by yourself. Maybe you can find something more interesting here. Now we will go back to our code. And as we read earlier in the documentation, we are using e.parameter.rectype, and I'm also using the short form for e.parameter as in params. So this parameter rectype is not a rule but a convention. Some people use rec and some people use rectype. I prefer to use rectype. For me, it is more clear. If you don't want to, you can just use e.parameter.rec. And if you remember, the e.parameter.rectype is the part of query string. That means that we will be providing values such as rectype equals to save appointment data, or rectype equals to save user data, update user, something like that. So that will be the rectype. And we will be using this rectype to identify the operation we want to perform in our backend. And other params are part of query string, which are the data we'll send from front end. We will be using switch to make switches between the rec types, and the default one will be the rec type in which we don't have any parameters or any rec types in this case. So we're just going to use it to test the connection and return a JavaScript object as a string that has the message connection successful with a status code of 200. And as for this function, content service, we will create it in a moment. But for now, we'll also return an object in case of some error, and it will be also inside the content service. So a content service is a function that is going to replace the repetition of the codes. Content service is a class provided by AppScript which creates an output, and it will take in data, which is an object, and then convert it into the string using json.stringify, and it will also set its type as a content service.meantype.json. The documentation about the content service is available in AppScript, so if you want to find out more about it, you can just read it in the documentation. Just know that what I'm doing here is I'm trying to convert the JavaScript object into a string, which we will send back to our front end. Okay, so now we will push the changes we made to the backend to our cloud project, and we're gonna need to do something in the front end as well. First of all, we will need URL address. It was shown previously in the documentation for DoGet. We will need a script URL, which I will call base URL, and we will also need payload like method, headers, which will be part of fetch method, which is provided by JavaScript. We will create that in a moment, and we will also create a convert payload to URL encodes, because we will be taking in parameters like name, address, emails, which are the values we get from our HTML inputs, and we will be changing those key and value pairs into query string like name equals to Nivesh and address equals to Helsinki, like I'm showing here in the comment section. So to do so, first of all, we will take in entries, object.entries from params, and then we will first pass those keys and values into an array and then join them with equals to, and then the map will return another array outside, and we will join that external array with ampersand symbol. And I have provided the link to the blog where I found this function. You can check it out by yourself. Now we will create a fetch data function which will be responsible for connecting our front end to the back end. First, we will create a new URL with query string attached to the base URL after the question mark. As you can see, this is a async function, so we can use await to fetch the data. Fetch will take URL, which also has query string, and then payload, which we created earlier, and we will await for the response. And after the response has been delivered, we will convert that response, which is a string, into JavaScript object, and then we will console log the data. Remember, in the backend section in the api.js file, we created a default value which will just say the message connection successful, and we expect the same message to be displayed later on when we test this connection. Now we will go inside of else block, where after the validation we display the console log message. Now we will remove that console log and then add the fetch data function, and we will not be providing any parameters. We will just use that default value of the params. And we need to do one more thing. We actually need the value for the base URL, and that value is something that we'll get after deploying this script as a web app from our backend. Now we will do the new deployment, and we will click the settings and we will select the web app, and in drop down who has access we have to select anyone. After that we will deploy the web app. It will provide us with the URL for the web app, and we have to paste that URL as the base URL's value. Now remember, whenever we make any changes to the backend that has any connection with the front end, like updating values, saving values, anything, we always have to deploy the latest code, because this URL will not be synced with the new changes we will make later on. So you always have to redeploy the web app and change this URL address if you want to reflect those changes in the front end. Okay, now we will test our connection works or not. First of all, let's reload the HTML page and refill the values again. And after filling up all the input values and checking the terms and conditions, we will send that value. And yes, as you can see, the data was console logged from the fetch data function we created earlier. It displays the message as connection successful with the status code of 200. So now that the connection between the front end and the back end has been established, next we will work on actually submitting the real data from the HTML form to the back end. When you will use DoPost instead of DoGet, then please don't forget to change the method in the payload in the front end section from get to post. Otherwise it won't work. It should be in the index.js file inside the payload JavaScript object where we define method for the fetch. Alright, so before we start to push changes and make changes to our application, first of all, I have created another file in our backend folder and I have named it config.js. This file will be a settings file. It will consist of all the IDs or API keys that will be used during this project. And as you can see, there are keys such as GPT secret key, form folder ID, docs folder ID, template ID, appointment calendar ID, mark reviewed, image link ID, and script URL. I hope the purpose is clear just by the name of these variables, but of course I will explain it. But first, you have noticed that I haven't used let or const keywords to define our variables, but I have used var. The reason for doing that is because if you declare your variables with let or const instead of var, then these variables will be local variables and won't be accessible from other files. So for us to make these variables global and make them accessible from other files and folders, we have to declare them as var, var, instead of let or constant. Okay, moving on. Now, let me explain each variable one by one. First of all, GPT secret key is the variable that will hold the value for the API secret key that we get from OpenAI's website that will be used while we're creating questions with the help of ChatGPT. Let me start with next three: form folder ID, docs folder ID, and template ID. Forms folder ID, as I'm showing here in this Google Drive of mine. In this project, I have created two folders, docs and forms. And the forms will be the folder which will hold all the forms that we create with the GPT questions. And the docs folder will consist of all the documents that will be created after the user submits the response to the form which was created based on their appointment request. And the last one, the template ID, this is the ID for the document which will be used as template to create the document with the answers provided by users. I hope I'm being clear here. As you can see, I'm also copying the IDs from the URLs for the respective folders and documents and pasting them in their correct variables. Just make sure to copy the correct IDs and paste it in the correct variables. Now, as for these last three variables, appointment calendar ID, which will have the ID of the Google Calendar, which will consist of all those appointment events created by the app script, and the ID for that calendar will be pasted here later on. And the second last one, marked reviewed image link ID, this variable will have ID for an image which will be embedded inside of every document that we create from the template, from the responses by the user for the forms. And the last one, script URL, will consist of the URL that we get after deploying this app script project as a web app, like we did earlier while we're connecting our front end to the back end. All right, let me push the config.js file in our AppScript Cloud project. Whoops, it says there's some error. It says the manifest file has been updated and do you want to overwrite it? Okay, what it's saying here is that there has been some changes in the manifest or appscript.json file in the cloud directory, not here, in the cloud directory. And let's see what are those changes, and if those are necessary changes, then we cannot just overwrite it. We're gonna have to copy paste it or do something about it. Let me go to the AppScript project, and there's no appscript.json file because it is currently invisible. Let's go to project settings and check the box that says show appscript.json manifest file in editor, and let's go back to the editor. And as you can see, there's an appscript.json file, and let's see what is the difference here. Okay, oh yeah, so as you remember, last time we deployed the project as the web app, and the settings related to that deployment has been added to this cloud project's appscript.json, but we haven't pulled any changes made in this appscript.json to our remote project in VS Code. That's why the new changes has not been seen in our local file. Let's just copy paste this appscript.json file into our VS Code's project. Okay, after that, let's try pushing it again, and this time it works. Let me refresh this project, and yes, As you can see, there is config.js file. Now we are ready to move on to our next phase of the project. But before that, let me also add git ignore file, and I'm going to add backend config.js. In the GitHub repository for this project, you will not find config.js file, but you will find another file, config.tutorial.js, and this file will have all the variables without any values, which you will have to fill with your own API keys and with your own folder IDs and file IDs. Now we are ready to move on to our next phase of the project. First of all, we need to pass these values to the backend. And to do so, we will now create a JavaScript object in our index.js file, which will be called appointment data, and it will have all these input values such as name, address, email, etc. And it will also have a rect type of update appointment, which we will use to identify the request we are submitting to our backend. And we will pass this appointment data object to the fetch data function, which takes in a JavaScript object. Okay, now we will go back to our api.js file, and from now on I will be using the code editor provided by AppScript instead of VS Code because I find it easier to code from here. So anyways, let's create a case which will have the value of update appointment, which is the value of the rect type which we just passed in our fetch data function. And inside that switch case, we will create a new appointment data JavaScript object, which will be a copy of the fake appointment data. It's a JavaScript object which I will create in a moment. For now, just assign the values that is being passed down from the HTML form to the keys of our newly formed object, that is new appointment data. And to create the fake appointment data and other functions, we will create another file in the backend, that is seat.js. As a side note, you can see that there is a mistake I did while creating a file because it has both extension of .js and .gs. The correction part will be edited out in the video section, but just make sure not to provide any extension while you're creating a file in a code editor provided by AppScript. Okay, now we will create the fake appointment JavaScript object, which will have a proxy values. I created this fake appointment data object as a proxy. It's easier to make some changes in the values of the keys and then submit it to our seats and test our backend function instead of submitting new value each time from the front end. And now we will go back to our API, and then we will return a function called update appointment data in seats. This is the function we haven't created yet, which we will create in a moment inside of our seats file. But for now, just know that whenever we submit a request from the front end with the rect type update appointment, it will call update appointment data in seats, and it will pass the values that were part of query string to this function, and it will return something which we will create in a moment. Now we will create the function update appointment data in seats in our seat file. Yeah, it's the same function that we called in the API. Now it will take a parameter named appointment data, and yes, it will be a JavaScript object, and the default value will be fake appointment data. Now we will first fetch spreadsheet and also data from that spreadsheet. And as you probably noticed, I haven't actually created variable $s because that is a global spreadsheet variable, which I will create in a moment. And another thing is current timestamp, which has the value returned by a function named getReadableDate. GetReadableDate is a function that I will create after this function, which pretty much just provides a date in a human readable format. Next, we will check if this data is empty or not. What I mean is, if the data only has headers row or the column names, which is the first row, then we will just push the value that we got from the HTML form without actually checking if the user has already submitted an appointment request in today's date. However, if the data is not empty, then we will loop through the data. Then we'll check if the data was submitted today by the same user with the same name and email address. For what I'm trying to do here is, we do not want the same user to submit multiple appointment requests on the same day. That is, if the name and email address and the timestamp, which is today, is all the same, then we will not be appending new row, but actually updating that same row. And of course, we will do that inside of the for loop. And the slice part, the current timestamp.slice, is that because the get readable date returns both date as well as time. And we are just extracting the date section. We don't need time part because, I can actually submit in different time, but at the same date. So we don't care about the time, just about the date. If they are by the same user at the same date, then we will be updating the data like I'm showing here. And then we get out of the loop with break else. If the HTML form is not submitted by the existing user, then we will actually append the new data. But to do so, we will actually check if the current loop is the last one. Because if we don't check if the current loop is the last one and we just start pushing the data, we might accidentally append the new value on every loop inside this for loop. So we don't want that. We just want to make sure we don't repeat pushing the data. After we append the data, we will get the new range. Since the data has been changed, we're going to have to take the new range and we will set the values. And if some error occurs, then we will just return status 400, error message as data. And if there is no error, then we will return a object with the status 200 and the success message, like appointment seats has been successfully updated. And we will also return the same data that was pushed through the HTML form. Now our function is ready. We will first create the variable SS at the top of the seats file. Next, we will create a new file called utils. And in that file, we will create the function getReadableDate. And it will take a date parameter and its default value will be the current date. Then we will return new date like this as it's shown here. These are all the methods provided by JavaScript. DoGet returns date of the month, and then we will convert it to string and then pad it with 0. The second would be the UTC get month. It will return a month. We will again pad it with 0. After that, we will work with time, get hours, and get minutes. And we're padding it because any value that is returned by these get date, get hours, if they are between 1 to 9, then they don't have 2 digits, and we want 2 digits. So we would add 0 at the beginning of these values if necessary. We will now not call this function from the HTML frontend. We will just run this with the default value of the fake appointment data. Let's run this function, update appointment data sheets. Let's see if it updates the data into our spreadsheet. And as you can see in the spreadsheet, the fake data has been appended to the second row of the spreadsheet. Looks like our function is working. To test it with the real data from the HTML, we need to first deploy a script like we did previously, and then get that script URL and paste it in the index.js file as the base URL's value. After that, we save the index.js file and reload the HTML file, and then we can refill all these input fields, and then we submit the data, and let's see if these values will be appended to the third row. Let's submit it. Okay, now as you can see, the data was submitted in the third row. Now we know that our HTML form has been successfully connected. By the way, if you resubmit it, it's not going to add any new row because, as you remember, we have implemented the check logic, which is if data submitted time, that is the timestamp, which is the first column, and the name and the email address of the user is same, then the system will not append the new row but update the existing matching row. Okay, I hope this was clear. To get the API key, you go to the OpenAI profile and then go to the API keys section in the left. After that, you can see the create new secret key button and click that button. After that, you give name, maybe by the project or something, and then you must copy the API key because it will not be displayed to you again. And then you can use that key in our project, paste it as the GPT secret key variables value in the config.js file. But I will delete this API key because I already have another API. I'm just showing you how to get an API for ChatGPT. Now we will implement GPT functionality in our AppScript project. To do so, I have already created backend/GPT file, and in this file we will first create variable named GPT base URL, and we will have the base URL address provided by OpenAPI's documentation as I'm showing here, and we will be using chat completions API. Now we will create a function named fetch data from GPT. It will take appointment data. We will be passing the values from the spreadsheet from name to the message, but for now we will provide the default value as fake appointment. Now first we will declare the headers constant, which will be a JavaScript object. In here we will define the headers of content type, which is application/JSON, and it will have authorization, which will be bearer space and GPT secret key. This is the key we earlier fetched and which you should have already been saved in your GPT secret key variable. Next, we will create options. This options is actually part of URL fetch app method provided by AppScript, which is responsible to handle all these requests behind the scenes. We will be using the one with two parameters. One is the URL address itself, and then another with params. These params will have headers, methods, as well as it will also have the payload. The payload will be the instruction which we will be providing to ChatGPT. We will use GPT 3.5 Turbo model. And the next one is very important section because this is the message part of the payload. In this documentation, currently instruction is for curl. Let me change it to node.js. So it will be easier to understand that way. Now, as you can see, this whole payload thing is actually a JavaScript object with keys like messages and models. And this message itself is in JavaScript array. And each array item will be JavaScript object with two distinct keys that are roles and content. Most of the time we will use the user role because we want to change the instruction. We want to tell GPT what to do and what not to do. At the same time, we will also provide some data from our spreadsheet. And one role we will be using for the system role is that we will just tell the system like you are a pre-appointment question creator, like it's being displayed here in the documentation. As you can see here, I will chain these user roles in separate JavaScript object because I want to provide clear instruction at the same time data to the ChatGPT. First, I'm telling GPT about me, that I am a freelance developer, and then clients often hire me for a freelance project. In the second role, I'm telling GPT to create 10 pre-appointment questions that should be very simple for non-native speakers to understand. And I'm also instructing GPT to go through client's message, client's purpose. And I'm also providing location, name, and email. I don't think name and email will have any effect. I'm just providing it here. You don't actually have to, but I do believe that location and purpose and message, this will actually be quite helpful for the GPT to create questions. After telling the GPT to what to do, now in the third user role, I'm also telling GPT to how to do it, because I don't want GPT to add any unnecessary sentences to the response. If you've used ChatGPT, I'm sure you have noticed ChatGPT also provides other unnecessary answers like, here are your questions, I hope this helps, and this and that. But I don't want that. I only want those 10 questions to be inside of a JavaScript array, like I'm telling the GPT here in the third user role. The most important thing you have to remember is that exclamation and important part that I'm adding at the instruction, because I've experimented with it, and without that part, GPT will ignore this instruction and also add those unnecessary sentences with the response. But if I add this exclamation and important, then it understands that I don't want that short talk, and it will just return JavaScript array with 10 questions as a response. Now we will provide the temperature, which is 0.7, and then we will use URL fetch to call the API key and get the response, and then we will parse it as a JavaScript object as it's being shown in this documentation down below here. Completion.choices, and the first item, then message, then content. And we will log the response as well as the content part of the response. And after that, let's try to console log it. For now, we want to make sure that everything works before saving anything in the spreadsheet. You might be asked to provide permission by the app script. You make sure you provide the permission. Without that, the function will not work. After that, you probably have to run the function again. After that, you will be able to see two output. One is the whole response, and then another is the content provided by ChatGPT with 10 questions in it. You can also check if the response provided by the GPT aligns with the message and the purpose in the fake appointment data. I'm sure it does. Now we will return the content, and if some error occurs, we will instead return a string, and it will also toast the same error message. Just in case if we are running the GPT from the menu, then this toast function will let you know that some error occurred. Now our GPT function is ready to be implemented in our spreadsheet. But before that, I am providing you here a URL that is a link to a Reddit post. In this post, many developers and users of the GPT are discussing how to get specific response from GPT in a specific format. You can read this post and maybe find something else that will be helpful for your situation. Now we want to save that response returned by the ChatGPT into our GPT questions column in our spreadsheet. To do so, let us first create another function in our seats file, which will be named update seats with GPT questions. And then we will declare a new variable, which will be called last row index of prev iteration. It will fetch a value from a class named last used row by GPT property, which I will go through in a moment. I'm trying to fetch the last used row by the GPT during iteration, because if you implement this system and if you get lots of appointment requests or lots of data added to your spreadsheet, then you're going to have hundreds and thousands of rows. And what happens is there's a limitation implemented by Google that will force any function to stop running after 6 minutes of execution, which means that whenever you have thousands of rows, it's possible that your function will be interrupted by the system before it finishes executing, and then it might cause unwanted error and cause the system to break down. To prevent that, it's advisable to actually save the last used row. Let's say we first iterated until 100 rows in the seats, and then we saved the 100 rows. is a script property. I will talk about the script property in a moment. Let's say we save the last used row in a memory. For the next time when the function is executed, we don't have to start over from the row 1. We can just start from the row 101. To do so, we're gonna actually have to save the row number to the script property as well as cache. To do so, let's go to utils and create this last used row by GPT property class. As you can see, I have added few other codes in our utils file. The first one is script cache key. It is just an enum that has same key and value. I have created it because I don't want to get any typos. So it's the same for script cache key and the script prop key. If you go to the last used row by GPT property class, in the set section, this is where we set the script cache and the script property, and the values come when we call this class in our functions. And we are setting both cache and property because cache is actually faster to fetch than property. And as you can see, the third value in the cache section is the number, which is the seconds. That is the number of seconds in 6 hours. The maximum time any script cache or user cache or document cache can be saved is like 6 hours. After 6 hours, it will be removed. And as you go down below to get method, then you will see that first I'm fetching cache. And if the cache is empty, I'm fetching property. This is how we will be using last used row by GPT property and try to escape the error caused by the timer limit by the system. I'll also link the documentation for script cache and properties in the description section, and you can learn about the methods provided by script cache and script property there. Okay, now let's go back to our code. As you can see, there's a start time constant and it has the value of date.now, and we are declaring it here because we are counting if the function has ran already for 5 minutes. I will later on, after this function, create another function. In this function, we'll take in this start time value and then it will subtract this start time value with the current time. And if it exceeds 5 minutes, then it will return true, else it will return false. And if the function returns true, then we will stop the execution of this object seeds question and then save the last used row that was successfully implemented before we stop this function. And then if the last used row is greater or equal to the data's length, which means that no new data was added to the spreadsheet, then we don't have to go any further. We can just return. Else, we will create another variable called index pause, because we are later on going to loop through the data from the spreadsheet and we are trying to provide the accurate index position for the data to start looping from. And if the previous iteration is 1 or less than 1, we can just start from 1. What I mean is, if the previously saved last used row by GPT property value is 1, then it means that we have to start from the first index, first row. Else, we are subtracting 1 because the indexing from the JavaScript array, which will be the data we later on fetch, starts from 0, not from 1. But in spreadsheet, the index position of the rows start from 1, not from 0. That's why I'm subtracting 1. Okay, sorry for the long explanation, and I hope I was clear enough. Now we will loop through it. As I mentioned earlier, I am checking if the 5 minutes over here and I'm passing the starting time here. And if the 5 minutes is already over, which means that after each loop we will check if the loop has ran over 5 minutes. And if so, we will break this for loop and we will save the data that was already fetched by the GPT into the spreadsheet, and we will save the last used row to the last used row by GPT property class, and then we will stop this function. If we don't break, then we will check if the 9th value in the data or the 10th value in the spreadsheet is not empty. And this 10th column is actually the GPT question column. And if this column or if this value is actually empty, we will call fetch GPT data function we earlier created in the GPT file. But if this GPT value is not empty, then we will skip this loop. But mind you, we also return error from the GPT, and I'm not taking it here, and I'm giving that task to you to improve your code. You can add another logic. Let's say if this data is equal to some error occurred, or if this data is empty altogether, then we call the GPT, else we don't call the GPT and we skip the loop. Now we will call the GPT function and assign that array which is returned by the GPT to a new variable called GPT questions. And since GPT questions will be an array, we can just assign that to the 9th item in the current row of the loop, like I'm doing here. And then we update last row used in current iteration because if somehow the 5 minutes is over and we're gonna have to break in the next loop, then we will use this value to update last row used by GPT property outside of this for loop. And let's get out of this loop, and then we will set the new value with the new data that has GPT's questions in it. And then next we will also update the last used row by GPT property classes value, and it will update both cache and script property. And we are providing the value of last row used in the current iteration, and then we are adding 1 because, as I've already mentioned, the JavaScript indexing starts from 0, and in Spreadsheet the indexing starts from 1. Next we will create is 5 minute over function. It will check the time difference between the starting time when we are starting the function update GPT question, and then it also has the current date, and it will measure the time difference between these two values. And if the time difference is less than of the 5 minutes, which is 300,000, because date.now returns the value in milliseconds, so 300,000 is the amount of milliseconds in 5 minutes. And if the time difference is less than of the 300,000, then we will return false and keep on looping over the data. If the time difference is equal or more than of the 300,000, then we will return true, which means that the 5 minutes is over, and now we will have to stop this loop and save the progress. Okay, now let's select the update GPT with question functions and then run it. As you can see in the execution log, response is displayed, which means that now GPT questions should have been saved in our spreadsheet. Let's check out spreadsheet, and it has been saved into the spreadsheet. In this way, you can connect to ChatGPT from the Google spreadsheet using AppScript and then save the response into a spreadsheet column. And now let's go to the properties section from the settings, and if you go down below, you can see the script properties section, and the property by the name last used row by GPT has the value of 3, which is actually the last row up until which the data has been saved into our spreadsheet. On the next call, the GPT will run from row 4 if there is any data. I hope this was clear. Now that we have created ChatGPT's question to be sent to the users, next we will create Google Forms and then send that question to the user. Alright, so back in our project, I have created another file called forms.js inside of our backend folder. And in this file, we will create codes that will be responsible for creating forms from each question. And the first function is create form, and it will take in rows. And by row, I mean each and every row that exists in the spreadsheet inside the appointments worksheet tab. And each row except for the header row will be passed through this function, and it will extract the questions created by the GPT and create forms based on those questions. Now we will extract second, third, and seventh and eighth column from the row passed in the create form function, and we will set it up such that the name of the form will be name underscore email and then underscore on semicolon and then space and then date underscore at semicolon space and then time. And we are creating them in this way because it's going to be easier to identify his form by this method. Okay, now we will also extract the location of the folder with drive app.get folder by ID and passing down the form folder ID, which is the variable we created in the config file, and pass down the ID of the folder forms from our Google Drive. Now, first you should know that Google doesn't have a system in which we can just directly create a form inside of a specific folder. So we're going to have to take in another route where we create a Google form in our root directory of the Google Drive and then move that form inside of the target folder, which is forms in our case. So let's create a form with the form app.create and pass it the name we just created earlier. And then we would set the title of the form to preliminary appointment questions. And yeah, you can read about the method set title in the documentation as I'm showing you. It just says that it sets the title for the form. And now we will create a constant named questions, which is created by parsing up column 9, which is the ChatGPT questions column in the Google spreadsheet, like this one. This is the 10th column, so it will be 9th in the data we fetched from the spreadsheet. By the way, we haven't fetched the data or anything because this function is only responsible to create form from any row passed to this function. Now, after parsing the questions, we will then loop through each question and then each item will be passed to form.addParagraph text item .set title. And what it does is whenever we call this add paragraph text item, it means that is the paragraph which consists of both the questions and answer block, and setting title means that setting the question for that paragraph. And we pass the item, which means the question that we got from ChatGPT, to the forms paragraph. You can read more about it in the documentation. Now that the form has been created and the question has been set, now we will move this form to our folder. To do so, first of all, we're going to have to get the ID of that form and then get the file by that ID, as I'm showing here, using drive app.get file by ID, and we can get the forms ID by form.getID method. After that, we're going to move the form using file.move_to and passing of the destination folder, which we fetched earlier. And then we will return two things from this function. One is get published URL. Get published URL gets the URL that can be used to respond to the form. Not the form itself, but to respond to the form. And then we will return get published URL and forms ID. We need each forms to be linked with their own events and their own documents. That's why we need this ID. Okay, now this function is ready. We will now go to our sheets file and create another function called populate form with questions. And in this function, first of all, we will follow the same logic like we did earlier while we were creating ChatGPT questions or saving our appointment data into the spreadsheet, like using the property to keep the record of the iteration index and then also checking out if the 5 minutes is over. Same thing, except in line 128. And it says we will now declare two new variables, form link and form ID. They will be temporary variables. On each iteration of the data we got from the spreadsheet, we will call the create form that we just created. And we will call this method only if 11th column or the 10th item in the row is not equal to yes. Let's go back to our spreadsheet, and it means that the K column, which is form created, and if the form has not been created, then it will be empty. If it has been created for this row already, it will have the value of yes. So we will skip that loop. And if we don't, then we go to the next line. We call the create form function and we pass the row to that function, and it will do its job and create a form and then move it to the forms directory inside of our Google Drive. And then it will return two values, which will be link and ID in that order, which will be then assigned to the empty variables we just created earlier on outside of the for loop. And next, we will set the data's value, which is the spreadsheet's data. We will first assign yes to the 11th K column, which is form created column, and then we will assign the next column with the form's link value and the one after that with the form ID. Okay, let's go to spreadsheet. The 11th one is the form created, then the column after that is the form link, as I'm showing it to you here, and the next one would be form ID, like I just mentioned in the function. Okay, after we set it up, we're gonna have to update the current iteration like we did in the previous functions, and then we will update the value of the appointment spreadsheet, and then of course we're gonna also have to update the property to be set up to the last row that was used to create the Google form with the ChatGPT questions. Now, of course, we're gonna have to write the code for these properties as well, which I've already done in the utils file. As I'm showing you here, the last row used by form property. Everything else is same except for the keys and the values that will be used for cache. Okay, now let's select that function populate form with questions and run it. See if our code works or not. Okay, it's running, it's console logging the row. Now, I believe it's creating a new form and it's moving on to the second row. Let's go to our drive in the forms. And yeah, you can see that the first form is created, and now the second one is created by the app script, and it has questions and answers. By the way, all the answers has been set up as long text format, nothing else. Okay, so let's see if there's any difference in the spreadsheet. As you can see, the form created section has guess value, the form link has response link of the form, then the next one, the form ID has the IDs for those forms which were created, and moved to the forms folder in our Google Drive. This is the response link to the R2 Karyaline form which was created. The name of the form as it's displayed has name, email address, and then date and time as well. And now let's see if the property was updated, and go to the settings and go down below in the script properties section, and yes, the new property was added with the name last used row by the form, and its value is 3, which is the last row with the value in our spreadsheet. By the way, in the utils files, I've also created another function to remove all props and caches, and it is just responsible to remove all the properties and the caches which have been saved in the system by the app script, and you can see the code here. I have created this function because when we are testing, we make some mistakes, and I want to reset these properties in cache so that I can test properly. Okay, so now that we have created these forms, we're going to have to send it to the user who have submitted those HTML form in our system, and we're going to create functions to send an email with the form links inside of them in the next section. Okay, in this section, we will create functions that will be responsible to send the email to the user with the form links requesting them to submit the response to the questions that was created by the ChatGPT and later on converted into Google form. For that, I have created a new file in the backend with the name email, and now we will create send email function. This function will take 3 parameters: name, client email, and the response link to the form. First, we will create a template with pre-filled values and few variables. The first variable it will take is name, and the second one will be the form URL. This is just a template. You can create your own template, but make sure to add these 2 variables. Now we'll use mailapp.sendEmail method. MailApp is one of the ways to send email provided by the Google App Script, which is easy to use, and you can read more about it in the documentation. And it has method called send email, which will take 3 parameters: email, and then subject, and then email body, which is template in our case. Okay, now that it's ready, we're going to go to the utils file and create similar classes like we did for previous functions. Of course, the name and the keys we use will be different, and we will add values in the enums as well with last used row by Gmail cache and last used row by Gmail. Okay, now we will go to seats file and then create another function which will be called email form link to the user. And this function will, like the previous ones, will use the same logic, and then we will loop through the data from the spreadsheet. It will check if the 5 minutes is over like previously, and in the next section we will check the 11th and 13th item in the row, which will be 12th and the 14th column. And the 12th column is the form link column, as I'm showing you here, and the 14th column is email sent column. And if the form link is empty, or if the email has already been sent, then we will skip this loop. And if we don't skip the loop, then we will go to the next line where we will call send email function, which we just created in the email.js file. And we will pass name, email, and the form link, which are 2nd, 3rd, and the 12th column in the spreadsheet. And after that, we will set the what's the email sent column's value to yes, which will be 14th column, because we don't want to send email again and again. Then we will follow the same procedure like we did in the previous functions. We will update the iteration row, and then also reset the values of the spreadsheet with new values, and then this function is ready to be ran. Okay, now let's select this function and we run this function. Before that, I'm gonna have to change the email address, because earlier on we created the fake appointment data, and this email address is actually not the real email address. So I'm gonna change this email address to my email address, and then we will run this function now. If you're running this function for the first time, you will be asked to give the permission, and you should. After the function has been executed, let's go to the Gmail, and as you can see, I was sent 2 emails, one for each row. And just to make sure, as you can see, this one has the name of Nivesh Khadka, and the second one has Artu Karyalainen. But there's a mistake. There's an extra square bracket there. I think we made some mistake in the email template. Let's go and check. Okay, so there's an extra square bracket there, which let's just remove it. Let's see if the correct form response link was sent. Let's click on the link. Okay, now it takes us to the response link for the form. And let's go check if the 14th column, which is email sent, has been updated to yes. And it has been updated to yes, so that next time this function runs, it will skip the row that has yes in the value. Okay, now this is also ready. And let's go check if the property was created. By the way, guys, you cannot see the cache in the properties section. To see the cache, you're gonna have to call them, and there's a method available in the cache service. And of course, you're gonna have to create a function like I created earlier to remove those cache. It's your call. As you saw, there's a property last used row by Gmail, and the value is 3. And now we know that everything is working. Next, we will create a function that will be responsible to go through each of these rows and create a calendar event. Alright, so now we will work on creating calendar event from the appointment request submitted by our client. For that, I have created a new file, calendar.js, in our backend folder. And also in the Google Calendar, I've created a new calendar named appointment calendar. And I will be using this to submit all the appointment events. And to do so, we're gonna need the ID for this calendar. And we can fetch the ID by clicking on the options link and then going to settings and sharing. And after that, scroll down below and you will see the calendar ID and this long string, which looks like a weird email address. This is actually the ID. Okay, now let's copy this value and we will paste it in our config.js file as the value of appointment calendar ID, and save the file. And let's go back to the calendar.js file. And now we will create a function named create calendar event. And this function is solely responsible to create an event using the ID we just saved. And it will take 3 parameters. First is title, which will be the title for this calendar event. and it will take the date in which we're supposed to create the event and the starting time for this event. It won't take any ending time because we're setting up the ending time as the 1 hour after the starting time. Okay, so first we will fetch the calendar with calendar app.get calendar by ID, which is method provided by the Google Apps script. This one, it returns the calendar with the given ID. And then let's log the name of the calendar just to make sure that we have fetched the accurate ID. Okay, let's run this function. Now let's look at the execution log, and the name has been displayed, and the name is appointment calendar as it's shown here. Okay, now we know that we have secured the correct calendar. Now we will create an event in that calendar with the method called create event provided by Google Apps script, and it will take 3 parameters, which will be title, start time, and end time. And if you look at the start time and end time section, it is not just time, it also takes in date. So remember, we have to actually concatenate both date and the time, which this create calendar event function is getting as a parameter, and we will concatenate date and the start time. And in this line, as you see, I have not just concatenate date and the starting time, I have sliced the first 2 string in the starting time, which will be the hour values. As you can see in this pick appointment data in the time section, in this 10 o'clock value, the first 2 strings are the hour and the last 2 strings are minutes. So we're slicing the first 2 string and converting it into a number, and then adding 1 to that number, and then converting that 10 into 11. So we're just adding 1 to make this calendar event 1 hour window. Now it will create event. After that, we're setting this event to pale red color. In this documentation, in the event color enums, you can check out other values that can be provided for the color of the calendar. And then we will also return the event ID because we're gonna need to save this ID in our spreadsheet, and else we will return nothing. Now we'll have to make some changes in our spreadsheet through the function in the 15th column, which is calendar event created, and set the values to yes after we create the event for each row. To do so, we will create another function in the calendar file, and we will name it initial calendar appointment event handler. It will actually fetch 2 tabs. The first one is the appointment, and another one is cal event handler. And the cal event handler has 4 columns: event ID, form ID, doc link added, and reviewed. Event ID will consist the ID for the event. Form ID will have IDs of the forms fetched from each row from the appointment sheets while we're creating the event. In this way, we connect an event to the forms, and in turn creating a connection between each row in the calendar event handler sheets and the appointment sheets. The third column, doc link added, is asking if the document has been created from the template based on the answers provided by the user per those form link that was sent to them. And this fourth column, reviewed, is checking if the owner has actually reviewed the document that was created by the app script. Now we will go through the appointment data, and if the last column is not yes, that is if the event has not been already created, then we will call the create calendar event function. And if you remember, the first parameter for this is title, and we're setting up the title as such that it will have the string such as name of the client, and then comma, and then space 4 will have the purpose for what. And the second parameter is the date, and the third parameter is the time. And after that, we assign the value returned to the variable named event ID. We're going to check if something is returned, that is event ID is returned, and if so, we will push the event ID and the form ID and 2 empty values to the calendar data, like I'm doing here. Also, we will now change the 15th column in the appointment worksheet, this one, to yes, if the attempt was successful, that is. And with this, our function is ready to be tested. Let's run this function. First, let me change the date in the appointment sheets to today's date, because we don't want to just keep on searching to the whatever date was there. Select the function, and then run it. Okay, now that the execution has stopped, it has created the event in today's date. But if you look at the time section, it is actually incorrect. The time is actually been set up to 8 to 9, which is wrong because time was supposed to be 10 to 11. Now let's check where this error happened. First, let's go to the settings of this file and check if the time zone is accurate. My time zone is not Bucharest but Helsinki. I've set the time zone to Helsinki, and let's delete those yes from the 15th column because I want to run the function again. And let's empty out the cal events handler, and then we will go to the calendar event and delete those both events. Okay, now that everything has been reset, let's run this function again. Again, it's not working. And now I will go to the settings of the calendar, check the time zone of this calendar. Okay, so it's not in the Helsinki's time, so I'm going to change it to Helsinki's, and let's go back. And now the time has been adjusted to the proper time zone. So it was not the problem with the code, but the time zone. While you're doing this stuff, sometimes the settings in your system can cause the misunderstanding. So make sure to check this by yourself as well. So now our event has been created. Next, we will work on the documents section. Now, to create docs, before we collect the responses from the forms and then create a document from each of the responses from each of the form, I've set up my system in such a way that these all settings, these all configurations are handled by different worksheet, that is form responses handler sheet. And this sheet will first go through each rows in the appointment sheet and then add the form ID that was already created by the system to its first column as is being displayed here. After that, we will set up a system in such a way that another function will go through each ID and then look to the second column of this form handler, which is doc created, and if the second column has yes value and if the third one has a link to the document created, then we will skip that loop. If not, we will collect the response from each form using that ID in the first column, and then we will create the document, and then we will change the values of the second and third column with the relevant data. But first, to do so, we're going to have to add all those forms IDs from the appointment sheet to this form responses handler sheet. So let's first create a function that we will name add new form details to response handler sheet. It's a very weird name, but I hope it's clear. Add new forms details to respond handler sheets. Okay, now we will fetch appointment sheets and get values of all the data in the appointment sheets. And if the appointment data or the appointment sheets is empty, or if it just has the header column, which is the first row, then we will just return. We don't have to do anything else. Else, we will also get form ID section from the appointment sheets. And of course, we'll need that because this is the value which we will add to the form response handlers sheets first column. And we will get that with, of course, getting the range from 2 to 13 and the appointment data dot length -1 because we start from 2 and then get the values. Now, we will also fetch forms handler sheets and all the data in the form handler. Now we will check if the form ID has already been added to the form response handler from the appointments sheet. Because if it has already been added, then we don't want to add it again. To do so, of course, we will check if the form handler data is empty or it has just first header row. If so, we don't have to check anything. We can just push IDs to the data after slicing. The values will have an array with 3 items. The first one is the ID and the second and third are empty. If the form handler data is not empty, then we will have to check first if the IDs are already added. To do so, let's first actually fetch the IDs from the form response handler like we did earlier from the appointment sheets data. Then we will loop through appointment data's form ID with the map. In this map, we will use actually IDs and indexes of those IDs because if those IDs are included in the form handler's ID, then we will return empty string. Else, we will return the index, not the IDs, index, because we will actually use these indexes to get the correct IDs from the appointment seats data, not the seats, but the data. So we need the indexes. And we're adding one because the data was actually fetched from the first row and the IDs was actually fetched from the second row. So we just want to match those indexes correctly. And coming outside of the map, which will return empty string in case if the ID already is included, and the index if the ID wasn't there. To filter out those empty quotes, we will use filter string to just get the strings and remove the empty quotes. And then we have all these indexes of the IDs in line with the IDs that were not present in the form response handler but present in the appointment seats. Now that the IDs indexes has been fetched, we will check if the length of this array is less than or equal to 0. If so, we don't have to do anything. We can just return. If not, we're going to have to get those IDs from the correct indexes and then add them to the form handler data. Okay, now after that, since we made some changes in the form handler data, we're going to have to save that data. And then we refresh the spreadsheet with the latest changes. And then we wait for 0.1 second to give the system time to reflect the changes. Now we're ready to run this function. Let's go to the spreadsheet. And yeah, 2 rows have been added to form response handler seats with the IDs of the form. Before we create a document, let's actually go over the template I have prepared to use in this tutorial. In this template, there are placeholders with double curly braces and then the name, client underscore name, client underscore email, date, time, etc. So when we are creating a document, placeholders like name, client underscore name, client underscore email, these will be replaced by relevant data like name, email, appointment date, questions, time, etc. And then as you go down below, you will see the questions and answer sections. They have different variable names like question 1, question 2 for the questions, and then response underscore question underscore 3 for the answers section. So for instance, the question underscore 3 will be replaced with the curly braces by the question that is in the number 3 in the list of questions. And the response underscore question underscore 3 will be replaced by the answers provided by the client for this question. And as you go to the last page, there is another placeholder that has mark as reviewed button. This placeholder will be replaced by an image which will have a link embedded to it. This link will be responsible to mark the calendar event related to this document and then change the color of the event from red to green. Okay, I was clear. Now to code the document related changes, I have created another file in our backend folder called docs.js. In here we will create another function which will be named create document. This function will be actually responsible to create a document taking in whatever responses it will get as a parameter, which is actually the first parameter. And the second parameter, form name, will be the name of the form which the responses belong to. And the event ID is the event which is related to this appointment. Next, we will get the documents folder and documents template. Document folder because we need to create the document in this folder, and the template because we will be using this template as the base to create this document with the responses this function gets. And the values have already been added to the config.js file. If you haven't already, please add the value in here. Now we will get the client's details from the form name. As you remember earlier, when we provided the name for the form, we actually concatenated client's name, email address, appointment date, and appointment time as the form name. And we concatenated all those details with underscore. Now we will split all those details from the underscore, and in turn we will get a JavaScript array with client's name, then email, then appointment date and appointment time in that order in the client's details array. As I'm showing you to here in the form's title, the first item, Arto Karyalainen, is the name of the client, and then there is the email address, and then there is date and time. In the date and time section, we not only have the date and the time, but also strings such as on and then semicolon for the date, and at and semicolon for the time. But both date and time have 3 strings. We will slice the string from the 4th item, and then after that we will get date and the time without any extra strings. Now we will make the copy of the document with doctemplate.makeCopy, and then the name of the document will be the same as the form, and the folder will be document folder. And in this way we don't have to later on move this document to our destination folder like we did for the form. Now first we will get the document with the ID, and then get the body. The body section is the part which we actually see in the document, like the tables, images, texts, paragraphs, everything is inside of the document's body. Now we will create another string which will be the URL address, and this URL address will be API call. As you probably noticed, the pattern is very similar to the one we used while we are connecting our front end with the backend. This URL will not be used by the front end section, but the image which will be embedded in this document. Whenever this link is clicked from this image, it will call the function which is assigned to this rec type, which is mark doc is reviewed. And what it will do is it will change the event's color from red to green, signifying that the owner has gone through this document and is ready for the appointment with the client. And the event will be identified by the unique IDs, which is passed as the parameter in this URL. Next, we will get the texts, which are the placeholder in the document's template, which will be replaced by the actual values of the clients, like client's name. Inside those double curly braces will be replaced by the client's name that we got while splitting the form's name, and the same for email, appointment date, appointment time. And when we go to that question and answer section, I'm not actually looping through the responses, but hard coding the responses by the order of question 1, question 2. And this responses item, which is passed as a parameter to this function, is a JavaScript array, and each item in that array is a pair of question and answer. And the question can be get as a title, and the responses can be get from get response method provided by AppScript. You can find the link to the documentation in the description section. Please do read about those method and then functions in details. Moving on, we will now insert the image link with the function named insert image link. This is the function which we will create after this function, but for now just know that this function is responsible to insert the image with this link in the section of the body where there will be mark review button placeholder, and then we will return documents link, which will be added to the spreadsheet as well as the event to which this document is related. If everything goes by plan, we will return the link to this document, and if some error occurs, then we will delete the copy of this document which we created and then return nothing. Remember this because later on we will check if something is returned, which is link in this case, and if something is returned, then we will proceed further. If nothing, then we will not proceed further. Now that this function is ready, we have yet to create other functions. First one we will do is insert image link. To do so, first we need to get the ID of that image to be inserted. And to get the ID of the image, let's first go to the drive and right click and then select share option. And in there, click on copy link. After the share link is copied, let's go to our config.js file and paste the link. I've already gotten the ID, but I'm showing you here how to get the ID of any such file, image, or PDF. You can see there is a weird string after d slash and before slash view. That is actually the ID for the file. Copy that and paste it as the value of mark reviewed image link ID. Now let's check if we actually have image link text. If there is no image link text, we can just return. We don't have to do anything else. Get the element of that text. Element is any representation of content in the document. It can be image, it can be text, it can be table, etc. After we get the element, which is text element in our case, we will replace the text with empty strings. After removing the text, we will get the parent of this text, which will be an element container, and we will get that container as a paragraph. After we get the container, we will insert the image in the first position of that paragraph. After we insert the image, then we will set the height and the width of that image. And then the most important section, which is inserting the link for that image with set link URL. And again, if you want to know more about these functions, you can go through the documentation, which I have linked in the description section. Now that our insert image function is ready, next we will create a function named create new doc from template. This function will be responsible to actually fetch the forms and then go through the responses. If there are any responses, it will then call this create document function and then create the document and then add those documents details in the spreadsheet as well. For that, we will fetch a two worksheet tab from our spreadsheet. First one is form responses handler and second one is cal events handler. Form responses handler has details for the forms like IDs, and cal events handler has the details for the calendars. And we will try to accurately get the correct events ID and the correct forms with the help of these two spreadsheets. Next, we will try to find the correct cal event ID from the form ID. What we are doing here is first we will pass the form ID, which are in the forms response handler data, and then try to find the event ID which is related to this form in the cal event data. Next, we will loop through form handler data, and if the second item in each row of the form data is yes, which means that if the second item which checks if the document is already created for this form, and if the value is yes, we will not be creating anything. We will just skip this loop and go to the next row and check again if the document is created for that row. Else, we will open that form and get the responses from that form. And if the responses is empty, which means that the user has not submitted anything, then we will again skip the loop and go to the next row. And if the responses is not empty, we will only get the latest response from the user, because this form is only sent to one user and we only care about just the latest response and nothing else. And then next, we will get the event ID, calling this cal event ID finder and then passing the form's ID there. So after we get the event ID, we now have everything needed for creating the document. Then we will call the create document, we will pass the response, and then we will pass the name of the form, and then the event ID is the third parameter, and we are expecting a link. And if there is no error and if the document was created and the link was returned, then we will update the form handler data as value. Now that everything is ready, we're going to have to update the spreadsheet itself here with the set values. Okay, now our document creation part is ready. But remember, we have yet to write the logic that will be responsible to handle the API call related to mark the document as reviewed section. And to do so, now let's go to api.js file, and in there we will assign the rect type for mark doc as reviewed, and we will call the function called doc review status event handler. Yes, we have yet to create this function, and we will create this function in the next section. Just know that whenever mark doc is reviewed API call is made, then it will call this function and it will pass the event ID, which is also part of the query string. To handle the API call, we will now go to calendar.js file. In there, as you can see, I have created 3 functions. Update document review status in calendar event. The second one is update doc review status to calendar seats. And the third one is doc review status event handler. The third one is the function that was called in the API.js file. And the other 2 functions will be called inside the event handler. Update doc review status in calendar event will be responsible to updating the calendar's color from red to green. And the other one will update the status quo of the event changes in the cal events handler spreadsheet. Now let's go to the doc events status handler function. And we will call the update doc review status calendar event inside the try and catch block, and it will return its status code. Okay, so since we're calling this function here, now let's go to the update doc review status in calendar event function, which is taking in event ID. And in there, we are first getting the calendar event related to that event ID, which is getting passed as a parameter in this function. After we get that calendar event, if there is a calendar event, then we will change the color of that event to green. If everything is successful, we will return 200, which is the status which we are getting in the event handler itself. And if some error occurs, then we will return nothing. Then let's go down to the event handler, and if there is a status code, then we will call our another function update doc review status to calendar seats, and it will take again the event ID. As I mentioned earlier, this function is responsible to update the configurations that is related to the cal events handler seats. For that, it will fetch cal events handler spreadsheet, and it will get the data from that calendar. Since it has the event ID, we will go through the calendar event data. And in case of matching event ID, we will update the 4th column, which actually asks if the doc was reviewed to yes. And then since the data was updated, we need to update the calendar itself by setting the new values. After that, we will come down below again in the event handler function, then return this object with status of 200 and message of successful. You can now close this tab. So what is happening here is that whenever this link is clicked, which is in the image of the document, then this link will open up a new tab in our browser. And then behind the scenes, API call has fetched the correct event ID and then changed the color from red to green, and then updated the configurations in the spreadsheet. And if everything was successful, it will display this message. And in the line 85, where I'm throwing the error because whenever we're returning the status code in the line 77, if there is no status code, which means that if the event colors changing operation was a failure, then it will go to the else block and throw the error and then return the error in the catch block. Now let me go through all of the event that will be happening in order. First of all, everything will start from create new document template function, which will get the form response handler seats and calendar response handler seats, and then go through the forms and then collect the responses. And if there is any response, it will call the create document function and pass the response and the form's name and the event ID which is related to that form, and then create the document. And while the document is being created, it will insert the image with the insert image link function. And the link that is being inserted in that image will be the API call which we just created. I hope it was clear. In the next section, we will write a code which will get the document link and then update the events description section with the link which the owner can click and go directly to that document instead of going through the Google Drive to review that document. Now that we have the settings for the link that will be embedded to the image, And before we actually deploy the latest changes and then change the value for the script URL variable, first let's also work on the logic to add those document link which will be created to the description inside the calendar event. Remember, we need this because whenever the owner of the calendar goes to click on this event, we would want to provide the link to the responses provided by their clients, and they can just click and directly open the document instead of going to their Google Drive and searching for it. To do so, we're going to have to first make some changes so that those document link which will be created and added to the forms event handler like we did earlier when we were creating the document. And now we're going to have to get that link which is in the form response handler data and then add that link to the event itself, and also change the third column which asks for doc link added in the events handler data to yes. To do so, I have created 3 functions in the calendar file. First one is add doc link to calendar event, and as the name suggests, this function will take event ID and the doc link, and then it will search for the specific event ID and then add the doc link in the description of that event. The second function is update doc link status to calendar seats. This function will get the calendar seats after the doc link has actually been added to the calendar event itself. It will also change the status of the calendar seats to yes, because now that the link has been added to the calendar, we can update the status to yes. And these 2 first and second function that I've added will be handled by the third one, which is doc link calendar event handler. This function will call add doc link to calendar event first, and then if the attempt was successful, then it will update the calendar seats, the third column's value of the matching event ID to yes. Okay, now let's start coding. First of all, we will fetch both cal event handler and form response handler. Why? Because form response handler actually has the link to the document that we're supposed to pass to the event, and cal event has the event IDs. Now we will loop through calendar data. We will first check if the third column, which is doc link added, is empty or not, or is the value is not yes. If its value is not yes, then we will move on to our next section where we get the doc link from the matching ID. What we're doing here is first we loop through each row in the form handler data, and in each row we will check if the form ID in that row is equal to the form ID that has been saved in the calendar event data. If it matches, then we will return the doc link, which is the third item in the form handler data. If nothing matches, we will return empty string. And this is where the map ends, and we will filter the empty string to get just the link. We're getting the first item in the array returned by the map function because map returns an array and we would just want the link, not the array itself. I know it's complicated, but I hope I'm being clear here. So now that we have link, we will call the add doc link to calendar event function and pass the link as well as events ID, which is the first item in the calendar data's row. And now we will code the add doc link to calendar event function itself. Since it has event ID and doc link, we will first get the calendar and then get the event with that ID, and if there's any event, then we will set the description like it's shown in the documentation with cal event.set description, and if everything goes well, we will return 200, and if some error occurs, then we will return nothing. And if the status is returned as 200, then we will call another function which will be responsible to update doc link status in the calendar seats. Now let's go to that function and code there. It will first get the calendar data itself. After looping through the calendar data, we will try to find the matching row by just checking the event ID that we got from the parameter to the event IDs in the calendar data. And when the row matches, we will change the third value of that row to a yes. and the third value is the doclink added column. And now we're gonna have to update the calendar itself. After that, we're done. It's been a long process in this section because we have created the document, and while we were creating the document, we also created a REST API which will be responsible for calling a function which will in turn turn the calendar event from red to green, marking it as reviewed, which will be a manual process, by the way. After the document itself is created, then the link will be added to the spreadsheets, and the link will also be then added to the calendar event, and then status will also be updated in the calendar sheets. Now that our functions are ready, we will check if everything is working or not. But first, to do so, remember we will only create a document if there is any response to the form. Currently, there are no forms with responses in our Google Drive. So let's pick one of the forms and then submit a response with some meaningless gibberish, because we don't really care about the response now. So let's submit the response like this. And as you can see, one response has been submitted. Then we will go back to the AppScript project and redeploy our script to accommodate those changes in the web app. So let's redeploy it with a new deployment, and then get the copy of the URL for the web app, and then paste it in the script URL variable, which will be used by AppScript while creating the new document and embedding that link to the image itself in the document. Okay, now that every settings and every pre-settings are ready, let's select the create new document template function and then run it. And you will be asked to give permission if you're running this function for the first time. After that, run the function. Now that the execution has stopped, let's check if the document was created in our docs folder. And as you can see, one document was created because only one form has response, and the name is the same as the form's name. Let's open it up. As you can see, the name in the email section, the user's name, user's email, date and time was added. And as for the question and response, questions and response were added, and the answers were just gibberish, so it doesn't mean anything. Document was created. Let's go check our spreadsheet if the changes were updated or not. And as you can see in the second row, the doc created has been changed to yes, and link to the document was also added. And in the cal event handler spreadsheet, nothing is changed here because we haven't called the event link handler function. We haven't ran that function yet. Later on it will be automatic, but for now we have to run it manually. Okay, now let's do that. Let's add document link to the calendar event itself. So let's go to the calendar and then select doc link calendar event handler function and run it. Okay, now the execution has stopped. Let's go back to spreadsheet, and the third column was updated to yes. And let's go check the event itself, and as you can see, the description section was updated and it now has the link to the document itself. Okay, let's click that link and open the document from there. As you know, the reviewed feature was added because we want to make sure the owner has read the response by the user and has made some remarks in the document and mark it as reviewed. Since the responses are gibberish, I'm just gonna add a comment section here. We have reviewed this document. Now we go down below to the image section and click the link in the image, and it will open the new tab, and it has returned a response that says the attempt was successful, and now you can close this tab. Okay, let's close it and go to calendar event. And as you can see, the event's color has been changed from red to green. And let's go back to the spreadsheet. And as you can see, the fourth column has been changed to yes, which means that all the settings has been updated and the user has also reviewed the document. Okay, now everything seems to be working fine. Next, we will work on the menu. And this menu will give the owner an opportunity to run these functions manually from the spreadsheet tab, but in a proper order, of course. To add menu to the spreadsheet, I have created another file named menu.js. In this file, we will create a function named onOpen. onOpen is actually one of the methods provided by app script. It is just like DoGet, DoPost, onEdit, and so onOpen runs anything that is inside of the function body. Whenever the spreadsheet with which this script itself is attached to loads or reloads. Okay, now first we will get the UI itself, then we will create the menu, and the title of the menu will be Manual Operation Menu, and we will add that menu to the UI with Add to UI. The first item we will add is the Update GPT with questions, because that is the first thing that happens after the appointment is added to the spreadsheet itself. And let's check if the menu appears or not before we add anything else. Let's reload this spreadsheet to reflect the latest changes. And yes, the menu has appeared in the spreadsheet. Now we will add a separator and add a submenu with the title of Form Related Events. And we will add two functions here. The first one is populate form with questions itself, because after the ChatGPT has created a question, we're going to have to create a Google form and add those questions in that form. And then second thing that needs to happen is add the details of those forms to seats, which is handled by that add new form details to response handler seats. And these two things has to happen in that order. So we're going to have to add this function also to the menu itself. Now we will add a separator again. And then let's reload and see how it looks like now. Okay. Form related events has another drop down and it has two functions to click. Now we will add the rest of the functions to the menu, which will be initial calendar event, create new calendar, which will create new events in the calendar. And after that, we will send email to the users with the form link. After sending the link, we will check if the response was sent and then create new document from that response. So create new doc from template function should be called. After the document is created, then we're going to have to add those documents link to the calendar event. So we will call doc link calendar event handler to the menu. And we will not add that mark review function because that is actually a manual operation that has to happen from the document itself, not from here. Okay, now that the menu is ready, we will reload the spreadsheet and we will delete all those values that we filled earlier while we were testing all those functions we created. So let's empty them out except for the appointment data and empty calendar event handler and the form event handlers itself. We will delete events in the calendar, we will delete forms, we will delete documents, everything, and start as an empty slate. Okay, now remember I have created this menu in such a way that it should be ran in the order they are added to the menu. Which means that we have to first create the questions from GPT and then create the form and then update the response handler, form seats, and then send email and then document and then doc link calendar. So it has to happen in that order. Okay, now we are ready to test our menu. Run the first function, which is create GPT questions. Let's click it, populate with GPT questions. Now we'll wait, and after a while you will see the questions were added to the GPT questions column. Now that we have questions, let's click the form related events and create and populate forms. The first option after the function has stopped running. As you can see, two forms were added to the Google Drive inside of our forms folder. After the form is created, we're gonna have to click the second option, which is update form info in seats option. Let's click that. And if you go to form response event handler, this function has added the newly created forms IDs in the form response handlers seats. Now we will click on next menu option, which is create new calendar event. Let's go to our calendar again. As you can see, two calendar events were created for the two appointments in the spreadsheet. And calendar events handler seats was also updated with the event ID and its related form IDs as well. And of course, all other values in the spreadsheet was also updated, like form link, form ID, calendar event. Now we will send this email to the user, which is me in this case, and we will check our Gmail. Now I have received two emails with the links. Let's check both emails first. Okay, now we will click on the response for one of those links and fill the information just to make sure that it works. I'm going to add a proper sentence here. This is latest response. Okay, let's submit it. Now we will check if the response was submitted from here. And as you can see, there is one response, and yeah, this is the latest response has also been added here. So now we know that the proper forms link was sent, and now we also have the response. Next, we will create the document from the response. Let's go to the docs folder and wait. Okay, the new document has been created with relevant info. Next, we will add those documents link in the event. So let's click last option in the menu and let's go to the event to check. Yes, the event was updated with the documents link, and the related settings in the Cal events handler was also updated. Now we will review the docs and update the review status. Let's go to document and click the image, click the link. It said it was successful. Let's go to the calendar and check. As you can see, the calendar's color was changed to green. So now we know that the docs review is also working. Look guys, I know that menu is not that helpful in this case, but I just wanted to teach you that how can we actually run some functions manually. At least now you know how to add functions to the menu, and hopefully you can use it in your own scenarios. Next, we will work on automating all these events in a proper order. Alright, so we're in the last part of this whole tutorial. This is where we will automate all the functions we created until now. And to do so, I have created a new file in our backend and named it trigger. Now I'll create a new function that will be named trigger handler, and then this function will call another function inside of it, which will be named switch functions to trigger, and then it will take a parameter which is another script property or cache depending upon when it's called. And the script property class that we will be creating in the utils file is called last use trigger property, and the switch functions to trigger will take the value of this property. Okay, now let's go to utils, where I have already created the class named last used trigger property, and everything else is same, of course, but the value we pass here is not row or index or anything else. We actually pass the trigger property or the function which was used last time by the trigger handler. Which means what we're trying to do here with the trigger is that every time this trigger is called, it will call this last use trigger property class and then get the name of the property which is assigned to the function that was last used. For instance, the default value for this property will be create GPT questions. And when this create GPT questions property was used or assigned, then we were calling create questions with GPT function, which is responsible to create questions from the message submitted by the client. And every time we call new function, we will assign a new value to this property. In this way, we're going to be using this property. To explain more clearly, let's go back to triggers file and create the switch functions to trigger function. What this function will do is it will use switch case based on the value of the last used trigger property. It will switch the next function to call. Just like in menu, when we manually call the function in a proper order, we will also trigger the functions in that order. So let's create the switch case and we will switch this triggers prop value. So I have created a new enum which will have same key and value, but I'm doing this because I don't want typos. Okay, so the first case we're checking is update calendar event with doc link. I'm taking this in the first order because the last function we call in the trigger is updating calendar event with the link of the document related to that event. Which means that if the last used property was this, then the next one will be creating GPT questions. That's why I'm using this in the first case. But one thing you have to notice that is I am just returning the function. I'm not calling it here. The function is being called in the trigger handler after the switch function is called. And we're also setting the last use property to create GPT questions in the first case. In the second case, where we're checking if the last use property was create GPT questions, then we will set up the property to create new form, and then we will return the function that is responsible to create and populate the form, which is populate form with questions. In this way, we are checking the case and then calling the next function that is supposed to be called if the previous function was a particular function. So after creating form, we should do three things here. First of all, after creating form, we will call initial calendar appointment event handler, which will create a new calendar event based on the appointment request submitted by the client. And I'm not calling this function when I'm returning ChatGPT, which is the first function call. If we go by the order, I'm not creating event there, because if you go and look to the initial calendar appointment event handler function, it also needs other information such as form ID. And form ID can only be provided if there is any form related to that appointment. That's why we need to create a form and then only create the event. That's why I am calling it here. And the next function that I'm calling in here is add new forms details to response handler seats. As you recall, even when we were using menu, after we create a form, we had to update the form information in the form response handlers spreadsheet. And then we are returning email form link to user function, and which will get called when the trigger handler is triggered by the system. And then we are switching the last use property to send email. After sending email, the next thing we're supposed to do is create a document. Of course, if the response has been submitted by the user, the document will be created. If not, it will just return. It will do nothing. And we will set the trigger to create docs. And after that, we're supposed to update the calendar event with the document link. And that is what we'll do, which is technically the last function to be called in the cycle of the trigger switches. And we will set the default to create GPT question. And yeah, I should be removing this initial calendar appointment event handler from here. Alright, so now our trigger function is ready, and it will be switched based on the trigger last used. And if there's nothing, which means if the trigger property is null, which is exactly the case when it will be called for the first time, and in that case it will go to the default and call the updated seat with GPT questions. Now that the function is ready, let's create the trigger. Let's click the triggers and add new trigger. And in the function, we will select trigger handler. And in the select event source, we will switch from spreadsheet to time driven. And then we will select minutes timer. When you're actually running this in the production mode, please select hourly or maybe daily or something like that. But for this testing purpose, we will select minutes timer, and the interval will be every minute. Now let's save it. And then, yeah, as you can see, the trigger has been created. Okay, now we will reset all the values. We will delete events that were already created. We will clear out all those data in the spreadsheet. We will also delete all the forms, documents, everything that was created by the script. We will reset all the script properties and script caches. We will delete everything. Okay, now let's go to the trigger part. As you can see, the trigger handler was already called, and it should be creating a new GPT question, and it has created a new GPT question. Now the next time it will be called, which is next minute, it will call and create form, which is the next function that should be called. And let's go to form and let's refresh it. Okay, after refreshing, we can see that 2 new forms were created by the system, and the related settings were also updated here. There's also other progress. Email has been sent and the event is also created, as you can see. Let's fill out the response quickly so that we can also see the document also being created and its link be updated in the events. Okay, let's go to the docs folder in our Google Drive and see if the document was created. Yes, 1 new document is created because we only submitted 1 response. And let's see if this document's link was updated in the Google Calendar. As you can see, the doc link has been added to the event, and let's click the link and it should open the document which it was linking to. And let's now review it and see if it works or not. Okay, it says it's working, and you can see the color changing from red to green, which means that the document was reviewed. So all the triggers, all the automation were working. Now what you can do is change the trigger timers from maybe minutes to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or hourly. You don't have to call the trigger handler every minute because you probably are not getting that much appointment request from your clients. If so, please do what you want to do. But I hope after this tutorial, you can create a web app and integrate different Google applications, Gmail, Sheets, documents, calendar by your requirements,